All right, this morning I do want to give you a heads up in advance. There are social media trappings to most of this conversation, but you don't have to be on social media for this sermon to apply to you. In fact, if you don't know much about Facebook, I hope you might know a little bit more by the end of the sermon, but more importantly, I hope you understand the Great Commission and how to live it out better, because that's what this is really about. In the Great Commission, Jesus gave a powerful and important mission to the church. And we see this in Mark 16:15, where Jesus says, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation." But this mission had big stakes. He continues in verse 16, "Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned." See, this is called the Great Commission, not merely because it's coming from Jesus, although that's enough to make it great. It's called great because it's big and lofty and important. This is the big and daunting mission that Christ left for the church and that he leaves for us today. But how are we to fulfill it? How are we to fulfill this huge and great mission that Christ has for us? This is one of the questions that Peter and the early churches were facing. And in his letter, 1 Peter we call it, it was his first letter to the churches in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey area. There were various churches that he was writing to, and he was writing to them to help address this topic. See, he was going over three main things. He was offering encouragement in the midst of persecution. He was explaining theology, how to understand God better. And he was explaining rules of conduct and life for believers. And when you add these three things together, what you end up with is a picture of what it means to live out the Great Commission and an explanation of how to share the gospel to all people. And so that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. As you can probably tell from the sermon title, which we're going to pull back up, this is a social media themed topic. We had some good guesses. I like John Polston. Your guess, what was it? Good sermon, turn right. Uplifting message, turn right. Nice effort, but not quite it. I'll give you a few minutes seconds to drop your last guesses if you're with us online or in the room. Drop a comment in the Facebook comment place. And I will tell you, somebody has gotten it correct. Maria Flanagan, way to go. It is, in fact, like, comment, share. Henry, did you know that? All right, so thank you, Henry. Henry has explained the meaning of each emoji for us in the room, and that is exactly right. Like, comment, and share. And Facebook calls these things, if you're like Adam back here with a fancy degree in marketing, Facebook calls these things engagement. It's a pretty normal word. It's how people engage on their platform. And these are the interactions, the main interactions. There's some more, but these are the interactions that people do on Facebook to send signals to Facebook that this is important. So, for example, if you go to Haven Fellowship Church's Facebook page and you see a post there and you like, you write a comment, and you share it, what's happening is Facebook sees that and they say, aha, this is pretty good. We should share that with some more people, right? This is engagement. And it makes posts reach a larger audience. They go out more because you're sending a signal that this post, this page, matters. Now, Peter is most definitely not talking about Facebook algorithms. He's not talking about online engagement. What is Peter talking about? He's talking about real-life engagement with real people. But he is talking about engagement that sends signals that something is important. It sends signals that the gospel is important, the good news of Jesus Christ. It sends signals that God is important. And maybe most importantly, engagement that sends signals that says the people that we interact with are important. And so when we read here in 1 Peter what we are about to see, it is a message that is about engagement. So let's look at 1 Peter. After introducing his letter in chapter 1, Peter goes on to chapter 2 and 3 to outline what it means to live as a Christian. We might call these household codes. I was going to say you can pull that up. I saw some eyes looking at the screen trying to decipher what that was. That's okay. Some engagement numbers from Facebook. In chapter 2 and 3, he begins talking about Christian behavior, about how we are to act as husbands and wives, as part of society and how we live. And in verse 8, he's wrapping up that section. And that's where we are today in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. Finally, all of you be like-minded and sympathetic. Love one another and be compassionate and humble. Peter writes finally here to let us know that he is summing up what he's just talked about. And remember, he's been talking about household codes, about Christian behavior. Do this and don't do that. He's letting us know this is the summation of that, but it's also his springboard into the next topic, and that is to share the gospel. So this section that we just saw, and I'll ask if we can pull that up on screen again, this section that we just saw is summing up what it means to live as a Christian and starting off how to evangelize. Finally, all of you be like-minded and sympathetic. Love one another and be compassionate and humble. That is the goal of all of this, the goal of Christian living. On social media and in life in general, there may be many opportunities to live contrary to this, to be argumentative rather than like-minded, to be angry and hateful rather than loving, to be disinterested rather than to show compassion. In the next verse, verse 9, Peter tells us what not to do. Not paying back evil for evil or insult for insult, but on the contrary, giving a blessing, since you are called for this, so that you may inherit a blessing. Paying back evil for evil is most definitely common on Facebook, on Twitter. In fact, I actually think that Twitter may have been designed and created just to give people an opportunity to have back and forths arguing about stuff. That's what it was designed for, in my opinion. But that's not what you were designed for. Did you catch here what Peter is saying you were designed for? What you were called by God, who created you for? You were called to be a blessing. You are called to bless others, to share them with love. And this is something we can do every day, everywhere. We can do this at home, at school, at work. We can be a blessing in traffic, when we go out in public, and we can even be a blessing on social media, something that we might occasionally forget. Now, Facebook gives us a tool to easily and quickly share some affirmation and be a blessing to others, to let them know that we care and that we're interested in them. And that is the like button. I don't know if you've ever thought of it as an opportunity to be a blessing, But when you see somebody else posting something on social media and you click that like button, you're saying, I see you. I care about what you have to say. To Facebook, it says, this post is important. But to the person, it says, I'm important. Not long ago, Facebook added a new emoji. It's this care emoji. It's like a heart and a person hugging. It's a very sweet emoji. I think it's a little closer to the type of thing that Peter has in mind when he's talking about Christian love and care. There's also the heart emoji, but all of these emojis are just ways to let somebody know that we're noticing and caring about them. But how much more powerful is it if we look at the people we meet, if we see people around us and we have in our hearts and our minds a commitment to share care with them? That we think, what are the like buttons I can click in this conversation to let the person know they matter? What are the care needs that people have? That we can, through words or even real hugs, let people know the same thing we try to do with that care emoji, that we care about them. And how do people feel when we do that? In a sea of negativity, we, as believers, can share a blessing. And remember, we were called for this. For Peter, this is the starting point. This is not the end of the Christian journey, but this type of caring, loving way is the starting point of evangelism. This type of living is all about our actions and our attitudes being characterized by care and love for others. But Peter goes on to remind us that it doesn't stop here, that this actually involves conversation. Facebook knows how important conversations are. Remember I was talking how they look for signals? So when they see this like button signal, when somebody clicks like, they say, oh, that post is kind of important. But guess what happens when somebody, instead of scrolling through the feed and hitting like and moving on, they stop and they write a comment. What goes on in the Facebook mind at that moment? They say, people care about this. And even more than liking, they begin to broadcast that more because their goal is to put out content that people like. They know when people are talking, it's because people care about something. Peter also understood that conversation matters. He understood that our comments matter. In verse 15, Peter says, and if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. Peter's assuming that the way we live is a conversation starter. I skipped over a few verses, verse 9 through 14, and in that, he has just finished talking about Christian rules for living, and now he says, when you face persecution, when you face hardship in life, live it with hope. And now he comes here, and he's summarizing those two topics. The topic of Christian living and loving one another, being compassionate. The topic of living with hope in the midst of hardship. And he says people are going to notice you in the way that you're living with hope, the way that you're living with love, and they're going to ask you about it. I see two calls to action in what Peter's saying. First is to live in a Christ-like way that others can see. Live in a way that doesn't put on display like the Pharisees at the temple, like broadcasting, look how good I am. But no, lives in a way that Christ matters to us, and we don't just hide it and only go to church on Sunday, but it's part of who we are. It's part of how we live life on social media, at work, at home, when we're out and about, that we live with hope and we live with compassion and love. Second, I think this is what might be hard for some of us, be willing to talk about it. Be willing to have conversations about God, about faith, about our hope in Christ. But notice what he's not saying. I think what he's not saying is helpful, because sometimes when we hear this, we hear these things instead, but this is not what Peter's saying. He's not saying, always be ready to preach a complicated sermon. He's not saying grab your commentaries, grab your Greek and Hebrew, and do that first so that you can go out and preach complicated, fancy sermons. There's value with people who invest time in that. That's not what this says. Always be ready to explain difficult theology. Was that what Peter was saying? Always convince other people to become Christians. Your job is to change how people think. He's not saying that either. He's saying none of these three things. No, it's much simpler than that. All he's saying is always be willing to share what God means to you. You don't have to become somebody you're not or convince people of things. Your job that is being given to all believers, he's writing this to the entire church body, not just to leaders. Our job as believers is to be willing to comment, to have conversations about what God means to us, about the hope that we have in Christ. Peter expects that our affirmation and love for others, our conversations, will give opportunities for invitation, for sharing. In social media, sharing means saying, this matters to me. When you see a post and you click share, you see a video and you think it's hilarious, you click share. When you see some beekeeper stuff and you click share, what you're doing is saying, this matters to me. It's not about convincing people to become beekeepers or to think it's hilarious. It's just saying it matters to me. But there's one more piece. Maybe it matters to you. I'll put it out there and let you decide. That's what sharing is on social media. I think it's a beautiful picture for us as believers to catch, because it's not like that idea that you need to go out there and somehow become like Billy Graham out there giving evangelism messages that get everybody to do this action in front of us. No, it's more like sharing something where we say, Christ, God matters to us, and maybe He would matter to you. Let me share. That's the picture on Facebook. And don't hear me telling you to fill your Facebook feed with long sermons. If you love them, share them. But you don't have to. Don't hear me telling you to become more preachy everywhere you go. In fact, Peter warns against this very thing. In verse 16, he reminds us, but do this with a gentle and respectful way. Do this in a gentle and respectful way. The idea is not to force our faith on others, whether they like it or not. No, sharing the gospel, as Peter describes it here, starts with affirmation and love. It depends on conversation, and it leads to a warm invitation. We started today by talking about how we can follow the mission of sharing the gospel with the world, Jesus' great commission. And I know this was a simplified look at it, but it's one that I think is helpful and that we can put into practice. On social media and in everyday life, it's easy to remember. Like, comment, and share. Like, express affirmation and care for others. Comment, have meaningful conversations. Share, offer invitations to others to experience the hope that you have in Christ.